So our rules of the road. Civic Engagement Beyond Voting is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. However, that does not mean we are neutral, and it doesn't mean we are bipartisan. Our organization is under the Indivisible umbrella, and our credentials are proudly progressive. In this election year, if you're a candidate, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. But no electioneering, no recruiting, and please no fundraising. Also, we pride ourselves on a civil and informative chat, so try to avoid picking arguments, but we love seeing where you all are from. So please do put that in the chat. We are recording this event, and we will be releasing the recording. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to attend today, please just send them a link to the recording when you get it. So with that said, I am going to welcome Shannon Watts to our group.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. I've been looking forward to this so much. Um, let's start right out. I mean, for those who may not be as familiar with your background, can you describe what brought you to this work, and how did your previous career prepare you for founding and rolling out a group like Moms Demand Action?
I'm not sure there was anything that could have prepared me for what I ended up doing with Moms Demand Action. You know, I had been in communications. I had a career in public relations and in corporate communications. And I was taking a 5-year break from that career to blend my family with my husband's. We have 5 kids altogether. And it was really at the end of that 5 years when I thought, okay, it's time to go back. I'm going to just polish my resume and see what takes me, where it takes me next. And what happened was that I was folding laundry in my home in Indiana on a very cold day in December, and I saw breaking news that there had been a horrific shooting tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. And like so many people, I'm sure on this call, you know, I just sort of sat on the side of my bed in my bedroom where I was folding laundry, and really, it was unfathomable that 20 children and 6 educators had been slaughtered in an elementary school with an AR-15. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that way today because there have been so many mass shootings since then, but it was somewhat novel in 2012. And novel's not the right word, but it was just something that didn't happen as regularly as it does now. And I went to bed very devastated. I woke up incredibly angry. And I thought, what can I do with all this anger? And so I had 75 Facebook friends, so I really wasn't a social media phenomenon, but I started a page where I said, I want other women and mothers to join me in standing up against the gun lobby, the gun industry. And I think I made that post. I walked away for a few minutes and I came back, and you know, my computer was just on fire with people who had the exact same idea that day. So I'm not sure I was prepared. I certainly wasn't prepared for the death threats and the threats of sexual violence that were headed my way. But I do feel like having a career in corporate communications was helpful.
Absolutely. One of the things I'm fascinated by, you know, in the world that we as organizers or activists live in, is not knowing what you're getting into. And I mean, you definitely referred to that. I mean, you were not prepared for all that reaction. So is that sort of a naivete, or what sort of a driver is that in the activism world, sort of not knowing what you're getting into, but going ahead with it anyway?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is there's nothing that you can or should be fully prepared when you jump in, and a lot of times you just have to do that. And I think, you know, I'm actually writing on a book about this right now, which is this idea that so often women have brilliant, amazing ideas, and they know so much more than they think they do, but they feel like they sort of have to wait until they know everything to move forward. And if I had done that, if I had waited until I knew everything there was to know about gun violence, which I knew nothing about, If I waited to know about the legislative process or lawmakers or organizing, whatever it was, I still would not have started Moms Demand Action 12 years later. So I want us to not think of those things as obstacles and as if, we're afraid of failing or not knowing enough or feeling like imposters. I'm really grateful that for whatever reason, none of those things stood in my way. I just had this gut feeling that this was the right thing to do, and that it's kind of like if you build it, they will come.
Hmm.
And I think I am proof positive. I was a stay-at-home mom of five who was living in Indiana. If I can start the world's largest or the nation's largest women's nonprofit, then we can all do that because I am not a unicorn. I just was very fortunate that I had so many people who also cared about the issue at the same time and really offered their skills to help me gratis for so many years. I mean, this is truly about an army of mostly women coming together and just being fearless and relentless and never giving up.
There's a diagram that we have in one of our trainings that this makes me think of, which is, I want to do this, do it. But the alternative is I want to do this, but I'm afraid. So do it afraid. And I think that, embracing our fear may be, do not expect to be fearless or without fear.
No.
How important is it to you? You have been a volunteer all this time, isn't
Yeah.
that right?
Yes.
So how important is volunteerism or volunteering as, sort of part of the entire basis for Mom's Demand?
It's a very interesting question. And, I think a lot changes in 12 years. It doesn't seem like a lot of time, but culturally, a lot shifts. When I started doing this work, it was important to me to be a volunteer because I didn't want to be a lobbyist. I didn't want to be anything that Wayne LaPierre, who was the CEO of the NRA, was. And honestly, we didn't have a lot of money. I mean, in those early days, I think, in the first year we raised $100,000 online. That seemed like a huge amount of money to me, but I realized it takes tens of millions of dollars actually to organize every year. But I think volunteerism is important. I think also there, and I'm thinking about this a lot as I write this book, there is something to be said for doing that for a certain amount of time and then moving into, using your skills to move into paid positions, because I do think so often women are expected to sort of do the unpaid heavy lifting of activism, and sometimes men have leadership positions that are paid. So I don't want to completely say like everyone should be a volunteer all the time, because I don't want to send the wrong message to women, because your time is valuable, your skills are valuable. You should never be expected to give those for an indefinite amount of time for free. But at the same time, activism is really built on the shoulders of volunteers, and not every organization can afford to pay people to help them do this hard work. So I think it's a really interesting and complicated conversation, but I also think, whether you're a volunteer or you're just, in the space of activism, Alice Walker, the author, always says or said that activism is the rent I pay to live on the planet. And I think that's how we should think of some kind of work that we're passionate about. You have to find a piece of it. You have to stay focused on it. There's no one in this country who can afford to sit on the sidelines, or if they feel like they have enough privilege that they don't have to be activists, then they should be activists for other people. I think that is the value of a society and a community.
Yeah, I think that will be really meaningful to a lot of people on this call. Now, you referred to the NRA, and I follow them very closely because um, I'm an operations person, and I'm fascinated by the troubles that they're having, and kind of happy too that they're having a lot of problems. But they are certainly historically weak right now. However, lawmakers, both at the state and federal level, seem to have internalized all their devotion to all manner of guns and how they interpret the Second Amendment. So, how do you see that whole sort of alliance of power? now?
Well, our theory when I started Moms Demand Action was we would shine a light on the NRA, thinking that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and people would see their misdeeds. Americans would see that the NRA is not operating like a typical nonprofit, that they're siphoning member dollars for, Italian suits from Rodeo Drive and private jets and family vacations to the Bahamas. They were not operating like a nonprofit operates. And not only that, they were becoming more and more extreme. I mean, they were completely out of touch with mainstream America because they knew the best way to raise money was to go as far to the right as they possibly could. I mean, their base was the original Trump base. And we were right. I mean, we were very diligent we joined lawsuits going up against the NRA. We invested millions of dollars in investigations against the NRA. We created all kinds of reports to share what they were doing with media. And it was really, it was hard work. And eventually we got to a place where, the NRA really is sort of hemorrhaging political power and money. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on legal bills. They don't have money anymore to do any kind of safety training, which used to be their focus. Their membership is half of what it was just a few years ago. We're twice as large as the NRA with 10 million supporters. So a completely different situation. And yes, I think you are right in that the NRA will never be powerful again. I don't believe. It took them decades to build what they have or had, and now that's gone. Even Wayne LaPierre recently resigned. They're still under attack. They're still losing money. All of that said, what we did not account for when I started Moms Demand Action was that guns would become an organizing principle for the right wing, that it would be a way to get new recruits in the door and raise money and energize their base about a whole host of things that had absolutely nothing to do with guns. And so that's the problem now, which is that guns have taken on sort of a life of their own. It was almost like, the Frankenstein the NRA built is now like independent and out there doing its own thing in the zeitgeist. And I'm not sure I know the answer to how we contain gun extremism other than getting more and more people who are part of mainstream America, making them use their voices and their votes on this issue, even more so than the extremists. There's been this very vocal minority for a long time, and I think more and more it's become a vocal majority on the other side, but that's just something that takes time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can all hope that that tide will shift. We are certainly seeing, and in our legislature, finally we're starting to outnumber the pro-gun groups. They are very, very active here in Arizona, of course. So, but I do think we're making some headway. One of the things that fascinates me also is techniques of organizing. And several years ago, when I started a book club, your book, Fight Like a Mother, was our very first book that we picked to read. And what I just enjoyed so much reading about some of the sort of disruptive tactics that your group used at the beginning. It really seemed unusual. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, sort of grassroots organizing and what I call asymmetric warfare.
Yeah, I mean, look, women in this country hold only about 25% of the 500,000 elected positions, right? So we aren't making the policies and the law that protect our families and our communities for the most part. And also we're only about 5%, 10% of Fortune 1000 CEOs now. So we're not even making corporate policies that protect our families and communities. So it's you have to really think about it. It goes back to this idea of using your voices and your votes, because we are the majority of the voting public. And we're swing voters. And so we do actually have more power than we think sometimes. And that is why I created this brand, Moms Demand Action, to make women feel empowered, to show them that they do have power. And And you have to believe that to go up against the wealthiest, most powerful special interest that's ever existed. You know, our volunteers show up at state houses and they have to face down mostly men who are armed with semi-automatic rifles or handguns. And so this brand, luckily, miraculously, has made women feel that way, right? They put on their Moms Demand Action shirt and they feel like superheroes, they've told me. They get Moms Demand Action or our slogans tattooed on them. And so when you talk about, you know, this innovative ways to go after this issue, we really look at it at three buckets. So it's culture. How do we change the culture around gun extremism? How do we change the legislation regarding gun extremism? So stopping bad bills, supporting good bills, passing innovative bills, and then working on this electorally. And how can we do it in a way that is unique and specific to who makes up the majority of our volunteers, which are middle-aged women and moms, for the most part. There are also men, there are also single women, there are grandmothers, but for the most part, we're talking about middle-aged moms. And then we have Students Demand Action, and they do organizing in their own way. But what's true and authentic to us were things like, well, where do we shop and where do we eat? And are they allowing open carry? That was one of the first things that we started looking at, because back in 2012, on February 2nd, gun extremists would show up at Starbucks because 2-2 somehow to them symbolized the Second Amendment, and they would open carry inside Starbucks where it was legal, and it's legal in over 40 states, pretty much unregulated. And it was such a great opportunity for us to show pictures of this, because back in 2012, most people had no idea what open carry was. It wasn't happening as flagrantly as it started to happen. And that was the push and pull. The more we pushed on gun extremism and showed photos of these people showing up with AR-15s in Chipotle and other places, the more the gun extremists kept showing up, pushing back on these women who weren't going to tell them what to do. And it was perfect because it created media attention and it created pressure on the leaders of these companies to say, is this really what you want inside your stores? And so we started coming up with these hashtags. For Starbucks, it was Skip Starbucks Saturdays. So we were just showing these pictures, but we were also saying where we were having coffee at competitors or at homes on Saturday instead of doing it during soccer games. And we just really, there was, for any of you who were on Facebook back in 2012, when it was still sort of a big deal, Facebook had this anniversary video out. And, you know, we capitalized on that to show how people were open carrying in different places. And eventually for Starbucks, the CEO, I think it took 3 months, the CEO came out on television and said, we no longer welcome not just open carry, but guns inside our stores. And honestly, that's not going to prevent anyone from not taking a gun in their store, but it was sort of the cultural signal that the CEO was sending, which was, I don't approve of open carry. I don't think it's culturally acceptable. I agree with these moms. They have power, right? It said all of these things that were so important. We replicated that at every single grocery store in the United States. There are only 2 grocery stores that now still allow open carry. Every drugstore stopped open carry. Almost every food store you can imagine, from Chipotle to Sonic. And it was all just with hashtags, burritos not bullets, shakes not shotguns. I mean, what social media allowed us to do was pretty astounding. It makes me wonder how Mothers Against Drunk Driving did what they did back in the 80s, because I don't think I could do what we did with a rotary phone and a car and a snail mail. But I think the bottom line is that activism is about how can we use our authentic and unique voices and power to put pressure on people or entities, and how do we keep that pressure on indefinitely until we can claim a win? And we always claim to win, no matter what. There would be people who would say to me, oh, that's not a win. Starbucks didn't put up signs. No, it was a huge win that Starbucks caved to the pressure of Moms Demand Action. I think about Kroger. Kroger was a grocery store. They had a completely conservative board. We did an ad campaign saying, oh, look here's this person with a skateboard. Here's a person with an AR-15. The person with the skateboard is not allowed in Kroger, but the person with the AR-15 is. I drove to Ohio. I met with Kroger's board. I think they called me a hippie. They were not very excited to have me there. I was like a 48-year-old hippie, I guess. But eventually we kept the pressure on, and we kept putting ads in, and we kept using our hashtags, and we refused to shop at Kroger. And the great thing was, and this isn't great for gun violence, but this was great for the campaign, which was there were sadly a lot of shootings at Kroger, and we could highlight the gun violence that they were allowing in their parking lots and in their stores. And 5 years, it took 5 years, and it was after the shooting tragedy, I believe in El Paso, which was at a Target, that Kroger finally changed its position. And so it's like, don't give up, keep the pressure on, and do it in your unique way.
Thank you. Um, I think that we as part of Indivisible always try to embrace the sort of unconventional techniques. Um, so this is sort of a multifaceted question, but how do gun violence, patriarchy, and white supremacy intertwine? If you can talk to that.
Well, I mean, we know more and more that guns are the tools of white supremacists who want to lash out or unleash, their anger on other people. And to be clear, white supremacy is not a mental illness. It is a choice, and every peer nation is home to some kind of white supremacy, to misogyny. But America arms those people. We give them easy access to arsenals. And we are seeing a huge uptick in mostly white young men who, call themselves incels or have manifestos, or who want to take their anger on society out on women or people of color, and they use guns to do that. I mean, hate crimes with guns in this country are a crisis.
Mhm.
And the uptick in that since 2016 has been incredibly significant. Now, most countries have guardrails in place that prevent misogynists or white supremacists or other dangerous people from accessing guns. If you try to get a gun in Canada, they're going to interview everyone within a 5-mile radius of your home. They're going to talk to your spouse and your ex-spouse. They're going to talk to your physician. They're going to do a mental health background check on you. They're going to do a crime background check on you. You're going to have an extraordinary amount of training. There's so many things that go into being able to get a gun in other nations, in peer nations, that we don't have here. There's something now called permitless carry that has passed in over 24 states. And it allows anyone without a background check or permitting or training to carry a hidden loaded handgun in public. And, if you think about the TSA line, if you want to get on a plane and do some serious damage because you want to commit a crime against humanity, then you are going to go through, you're going to try to get in the line that doesn't require you to have security, just like permitless carry, right? Like, that's as if you have no TSA in place. And it is not a surprise then that we have people who are going to temples or mosques or targets in El Paso, or churches, and opening fire. And it's senseless, and it's preventable, and it's tragic.
Mhm.
And we know that that stronger laws will keep dangerous people from having easy access to guns. Blue states have less gun violence and less gun death, and red states have more gun violence and more gun death. And it does come down to the laws that they pass.
So it does, I mean, the sort of the patriarchal and the supremacist, I mean, I feel those probably exist in other countries, but the difference is the access to guns.
Yes, I mean, every nation is home to all of the problems we have, whether it's patriarchy or white supremacy or even
Mhm.
mental illness, which so many people blame.
Mhm.
If they also blame video games. If video games were the cause of gun violence, Japan would have the worst gun violence rate in the nation. 6 people are shot and killed in Japan every year. And it's
Mhm.
because they have incredibly strong gun laws and they are not awash in 500 million guns like America.
Mhm. Yeah, that seems like the difference to me. So now I'd like to turn away or turn beyond Mom's Demand because I know that you are on to other projects. So could you sort of open that door, give us a little peek at what you're working on now?
Yeah, I mean, just to give some context, I never imagined I would be the leader of Moms Demand Action into perpetuity for my whole life. When I started it, I never imagined it would even last 11 years, frankly. But I kept asking myself every year, is this the year that I step back? And it really wasn't until 2022 in the summer when the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act passed, first federal gun safety legislation to pass and be signed into law by the president in a generation. And I was standing in the Rose Garden, and it just came to me. It was like, this is it. This is the bookend to your activism, meaning my activism, not everyone's. And that it was time for me to step back, and not only because I had run out of good ideas and good energy that could keep it going, but also because I think it's so important as a white woman who lives in the suburbs and was afraid my kids weren't safe in their school, that I would hand the reins over to a woman with a different experience. And we had hired Angela Farrell Zabala from Planned Parenthood about 5 years earlier, a Black queer mom of four in Washington, D.C., who has a much different experience with gun violence than I have. And so she is now the executive director of Moms Demand Action. And as I stepped back, I honestly thought, okay, I am going to take a year off. I'm not going to do anything. I am exhausted. And instead, I was running on the treadmill one night and I got a call from my phone said Maria Shriver. I was like, okay. And I mean, I've done interviews with Maria after horrific shooting tragedies, but I don't know Maria. And she said, I have a book in print. Will you write about women in leadership for me? And I had, as you said, I'd already written one book, and I felt like I had one more book in me, and I am in the process of writing that right now. I have to turn it in June. It'll come out in 25. But I'm just really interested in talking about kind of this is full circle to the conversation we had at the beginning, which is how do we show women that they have power? How do we remind them that we have power? And then how do we give them a process to unleash it and to use it in a way that, and again, I want to be clear, I don't mean you have to go start a national organization, but it does mean that you have the right and the ability to live in a way that you feel like you're alive. And, we carry the mental load and do so much invisible labor that I think it's easy to forget that we have the right and the ability to follow our passions. That could be something really little, it could be writing your own book or starting a Substack, whatever that is. And so I'm having dozens and dozens of conversation with influencers and celebrities and women from everyday walks of life who are telling me their stories of sort of how they start fires in their life.
Mhm. So that leads to my next question, which is in terms of starting fires. Could you describe what that means to you, starting fires or being a fire starter?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at what made me start Moms Demand Action, it was really like this amazing alignment of what I was passionate about, what I valued in life, and what my talents and abilities were. And I was able to like figure that out and bring it into alignment. And then to grow that once I started that fire, right? And grow it and sustain it. And there's so much that goes into that community and being able to let go of relationships that don't serve you and seeking out support from relationships that do. And some of it is just taking that first step because as I said before, that seems to be the hardest one for women to take, which is just deciding I'm going to put myself out there and take this risk, even if I fail, even if I look foolish, even if I, have to start all over again. And that's sort of the premise of my book. And if I have a Substack called Playing with Fire, where I talk a lot about these ideas too. It's kind of become a community. It's a lot of fun. We did a Zoom earlier today, and you have more in common than you might think.
Mhm. So is activism still intertwined with the work that you do? Social activism or political activism? I mean, because my interpretation would be you could be a fire starter in any realm.
Any
Um,
realm, any phase of life. I certainly will continue my activism with Moms Demand Action. I'm a volunteer in California, but I'm also passionate about a lot of other issues like reproductive rights and freedoms and maternal health. Um, there's so many different issues that, as I said before, like find a piece of the work you're passionate about and just work on it. I will probably be a surrogate as much as I can for Joe Biden. Um, I think swing voters, particularly women, suburban women, and sometimes people think that's a signal for white women. It is not. In fact, the suburbs are now incredibly diverse places, and those are the women who are going to decide this next election. And I think it's important that we're talking to them about the issues that matter to them, and that we're listening to them, and that we're empowering them, and so that they can put the same pressure that I helped put through Moms Demand Action, that they can do that themselves on everyone who's running for office.
mhm. I'm really interested in sort of the realm of power and leadership. What gets in the way, particularly for women, but I would say for probably everyone or most people, what gets in the way of exerting, understanding what type of power you have and how to let it out? Does that make sense?
I think we're just conditioned to not even feel like we have power. I mean, I think my friend Glennon Doyle says women don't know what they want because they don't know that they're allowed to want. And
Mm,
so I think it's like stepping back and even thinking, okay, do I have power? What is my power? And then it's this idea of, this book I'm writing. It's like, how do I identify it within myself? How do I take baby steps toward practicing it? And then how do I unleash that? And it doesn't have to look like I like painting and therefore I need to be exhibited in an art gallery, or I like baking and therefore I need to start a bakery. I think it can be much smaller than that. Some of the conversations I've had are really interesting. I mean, I've talked to volunteers who've said, the way I found my power was to realize that I wasn't with the right partner. I was able to, because of the courage I gained through Moms Demand Action, I realized I could live through a divorce and thrive afterward. It doesn't always look like what you think it will look like. And I think that's what's really interesting about it.
yeah, I like that. It doesn't look like what you think it will look like. In fact, so much of life seems to be not look like what you anticipated that it would. Let's see. Uh, why is it important? And I must have picked this up from one of the articles I read about you in prep for this call. Why is it important that Republican Christian gun owning white women get off the sidelines?
Mm. Yeah, and I don't think it even has to just be Republican. I think it can be, but I just want to use the example of the recent mass shooting this year, or actually it was last year in Tennessee, at a school in Nashville, where a former student brought a gun to the school and opened fire. And it was really interesting what happened. I mean, you could clearly see that the only thing stopping common sense gun reform, first of all, in Tennessee, were the extremist lawmakers,
Mhm.
because both Republicans, Democrats alike believe that, with rights come responsibilities, and that we should be able to regulate guns. But the other interesting thing I saw, and I do see a lot of times when there's a shooting tragedy in this country, is that white women immediately, when there's a school shooting, and it's not unlike what I did, honestly, but white women are saying, like, we have to ban AR-15s. And I'm not disagreeing with that. We do have to ban AR-15s. But when you come to this issue and you've been in it for a while, what you realize is that mass shootings and school shootings are about 1% of the gun violence in America. It's really the day-to-day gun violence. And that gun violence disproportionately impacts Black and brown people in city centers, that is killing over 120 people in America every day and wounding hundreds more. The majority of it is that daily gun violence. And you can't just get off the sidelines and care about gun violence because it has impacted your school or your community. Maybe that's why you get off the sidelines, but you have to eventually see that it's so much more complex and it's so much bigger than your school or your community. And you have to care about the solutions to all of it. And that includes, for example, unlocking money for community violence intervention programs. That includes red flag laws. That includes disarming domestic abusers. There's so many different things. And I just find it frustrating because I think part of my role has been to educate white women and to say, glad you're here. These Black women have been here a long time. How are we helping them now? It feels a little bit like Groundhog's Day sometimes. And so I think it's really incumbent that white women be thinking about this more holistically than just like having their blinders on.
Yeah, I find it incredibly frustrating that a lot of people don't care about something until it affects them directly. Talk a little bit about privilege, racial, economic privilege, and how those with privilege can best help those who may not share that privilege. Why do you say, and I think I pick this up again, Black women don't need allies, they need traitors. I
Mm.
love that.
Well, I mean, it goes back to this, what I saw happening in Nashville after the shooting in Tennessee were that Republican white women were getting off the sidelines and their goal was to try to change the minds of Republican lawmakers. And I'm just here to tell you, after 12 years of doing this work, that is not happening. The only thing that changed the lawmakers' minds is to lose their jobs. That's it. There has to be consequences for inaction or wrong action. That's it. That's the only way this works. There's no such thing typically as a wholesale change of heart and mind. I've seen it a few times. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's usually politically pragmatic. The reason that Mitch McConnell whipped the votes for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and 15 Republicans voted for it in 2022 was not because they'd all had a change of heart and mind. It's because they were hearing from constituents 10-1 that they better vote in favor of it, and that if they didn't, they were going to get killed at the midterm elections. And so they suddenly voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That is how politics works. And so I find it really frustrating when suddenly these white women show up after shooting and think, oh, I'll just change my lawmakers' hearts and minds. You're not going to do that. You're going to have to vote with Democrats. It's going to hurt a lot. But those are the lawmakers who, at least right now, are trying to save your kids' lives, trying to save the lives of most kids, just because of where we are, right? When I started doing this work in 2012, a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. Today, none do. The Democrats, for the most part, of the party that are on the right side of this issue. I think we'll all get there eventually, but that only happens when lawmakers lose their jobs. And so if you have privilege, if you have wealth, if people want to listen to you and want to hear from you and you can have those conversations, then you owe it to be advocating for those Black and brown women and to have the same stances and the same positions they do. There's that saying that we all say, which is, you're not free until we're all free. And I think that is exactly the case when it comes to advocacy.
Thank you. I think we all need to internalize that and keep internalizing it. I think it's a challenge for all of us. Now, just to take another sort of turn, I was fascinated by the genealogical research you did into your great-grandmother. I read that the other night. Can you speak about generational trauma and the importance of uncovering and speaking out about it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I named my organization Moms Demand Action, and yet I have such a complicated maternal side of the family, but I had known generally that my great-grandmother had been killed and that it had such a huge ripple effect for generations on my maternal side. And I wanted to, my grandmother is dead now, and I wanted to understand exactly what had happened. And so I hired someone to look into my genealogy. and uncovered all of these records. And what had happened is that my grandmother, who was pregnant, was walking home from church one day with my grandmother's sister, who was 15, and they were hit and killed by a car full of drunk drivers. They were about 20 years old. They were construction workers and killed instantly. My grandmother was 10 years old at the time. And what's so fascinating when you talk about culture and advocacy, I mean, they basically murdered my three people, two people at least, and all they did was pay a $100 fine, and no one went to jail. And in fact, the man who was drunk and driving fought in World War II and was buried with military honors. And you talk about a cultural shift. I mean, with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, thankfully, that would not be the case today. But that was just fascinating to me, and just really trying to understand what the implications were all the way down the line, in terms of mothering and parenting, and kind of my own interest in mothers, and ultimately, leading Moms Demand Action. I think that there's a lot of synergy there.
Hmm. Yeah, I find that I'm fascinated by genealogy too. Um, there is one really good question. There are several that have come in from the chat that I wanted to throw in, but one, what are your thoughts about the recent Crumbly decision in Michigan?
Yep. So I think it's an incredibly important decision because it's really the first time a parent has been held accountable for leaving an unsecured weapon available to a mass shooter. This was a very dysfunctional family. They knew their son was troubled. They went ahead and bought him a handgun for Christmas anyway, took him shooting, left it unsecured in a nightstand. And then the school, I would also say, failed because this kid brought a gun to school in a backpack. And even though they knew he was troubled, they never asked if he had access to guns, which is an important question. But this trial was the first of two. The father will be tried in 6 weeks. And it's very clear that the that the jury felt that secure storage, was the onus was on the parent, and that they failed, and that they were going to hold this parent accountable. So I think it will have a ripple effect.
Mhm. Yes, well, I think it requires consequences, for sure. Um, so one more question about, I mean, that will, I think, resonate with people listening is Arizona is still very much a red state. It is, our legislature is incredibly extreme. I mean, they have a one-seat majority in both chambers. It's very, very close. But that just means that the extremists basically run the show. What sort of work have you done in red states, and what encouragement can you give us?
Oh, I mean, I feel so strongly about this. It may feel like, I know it feels like, and it is an uphill battle, but I have seen so many states that we thought were hopeless flip. And what you want to be doing is always building the foundation so that when it does flip, you can take advantage of it. If you haven't done that hard work behind the scenes, then you flip and you can't take advantage of it. So, like, part of activism is creating that foundation as if tomorrow everything was going to change. When I started Moms Demand Action, Virginia was an incredibly red state. And even Mark Warner, the Democratic senator, US senator, was voting with the gun lobby, had an A rating. He voted, for example, in favor of concealed carry reciprocity. Like, he was very firmly on the side of the gun industry. He felt he had to be in Virginia. And then Moms Demand Action volunteers started cornering him everywhere he went, at events, at house parties, and saying, "How dare you? We're not going to support you if you keep voting with the NRA." Eventually, he changed his mind. He now has an F rating from the NRA. We started doing the same thing in the legislature, and just creating relationships. Again, it's about authentic activism. We would make cookies and go sit down with the lawmakers and try to talk to them, and show up at every hearing, and by the dozens in our red shirts, and just continue to amass power. and try to show that there would be consequences for not doing the right thing, and that you would be safe if you did the consequences for doing the wrong thing. You would be safe if you did the right thing. And then what happened in Virginia was the Virginia Beach shooting. I think that was in 2019 or 2018. And it was such a horrific mass shooting. And the Republicans were in charge of the entire state. I think they had a supermajority. They gavelled in for 90 seconds to talk about gun violence and then gavelled out without doing anything. And then there were pictures going viral because there were men with AR-15s trying to intimidate our volunteers at the State House that day. And we really were able to parlay that inaction into tons of media coverage. We outspent the NRA in their backyard. They're based in Virginia. And then in November, we flipped both chambers of the General Assembly. No polls predicted that, and elected a Democratic governor. So we had suddenly a trifecta, and we were able to pass over a dozen good gun laws in the following few years in Virginia. You're only Virginia governor for 4 years. That's it. They elected a Republican, and he has not been able to undo a single one of those laws. They're all still in place. So I've seen it happen in red states. We have a 90% track record of stopping the NRA every year. That includes in red states. So I would say even if you're not able to pass good gun laws, you can stop bad laws. And that is life-saving and matters too.
That is true. And we have done 7 years of defense, but that is, it will take as long as it takes.
Yep.
One other thing that interests me, do you feel that we're living in an unusual time of grassroots activism and individual impact, empowering individuals to do whatever they can to influence the direction of the country? I mean, that's what I feel here in Arizona, but I'm not sure that that is true everywhere.
Yeah, I do think that. I mean, like we were talking about the tools before. I don't know what's going to happen with Twitter, and that was incredibly useful back in the day to us. But just as tools change and evolve, you get new tools too. I mean, I think young activists are doing an amazing job by organizing through TikTok. So I do think that probably more than ever, we all have our own individual voice that we can use. But that doesn't mean you have to put yourself out there. There's still amazing things you can do. I think about, we have something called Gun Sense Action Network, where we have volunteers and all they do is make welcome calls. No new volunteer would necessarily get engaged and stay involved if they didn't get that welcome call. A lot of people have said, I called a bunch of organizations, you're the only one who called me back. There are volunteers whose whole job is to do data entry. Those are like unsung heroes. That's such important work. So you don't have to have a big voice and a megaphone or be on the evening news to be an activist. You can do it in your own way, in a way that is authentic to you, and it still makes a difference. So I just don't think anyone can afford to not be an activist right now.
Yeah, a large part of our work is actually encouraging people to make that first phone call,
Yeah.
take that first action, write that first email, because it's really the first one that's the biggest hurdle. And once you've gotten started, it's not as scary as it seems. So I am in love with grassroots activism, and I think a lot of people on this call are too. So I want to spend the rest of the little time we have left talking about how to stay in this work for the long haul, because I know that that is what every single person wrestles with, who's dealing with a problem that may seem intractable, it may seem impossible until at some point it does become possible. But the whole need to take care of ourselves, to establish boundaries. I really would love to hear from you on how you do that and what you would advise other people.
Yeah, we talk obviously a lot about burnout. I mean, I'm not a gun violence survivor, but I spent, most of my days, 7 days a week for 11 years, reading about gun violence and telling stories of survivors and victims and having to respond to mass shooting tragedies and from communication standpoint. And it can weigh you down psychically, obviously. And then I can't even imagine doing this work as a gun violence survivor, because that would be so incredibly hard and just so difficult. So we do talk a lot about taking care of yourself. Self-care sometimes can be confused with this idea of toxic wellness. I actually think self-care and if anyone's interested in reading more about this, Dr. Pooja Lakshmi, I just did a podcast with her on my Substack page where we talk about what is self-care. And she says, look, sometimes self-care is actually advocating for eradicating the barriers that you face, right? Like maybe self-care is fighting for better childcare. It doesn't have to be a bubble bath. It can be more complicated and more nuanced than that. But it also has to be, I think, taking a break when you need it. There were lots of times that, I have 5 kids, so there were plenty of things that were really difficult with them along the way where I had to just sort of take myself out of the game and say, I'm giving you the baton, you go, I have to take this break. And I think women sometimes feel guilty about giving work to other people. I had that. I also worried, oh, what if they do the work better than I do? Or what if I'm not needed when I come back? And none of those things were ever true, right? People brought new ideas and new energy. The work was still there when I got back. And I was able to step away and take care of what I needed to take care of. So I think that's another part of this too, which is, yes, it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it's also a relay race. And you have to hand the baton over when you need to take care of yourself. And that has to be your priority. And again, we talked about mental load and invisible labor. And sometimes I think we can get so bogged down by those things that taking care of ourselves just isn't a priority at all.
Mhm. Is part of that, though, sort of creating healthy boundaries, and how do you
Yes.
know what to say no to?
Yes. Boundaries. And that's, you can't just sort of say, this is a boundary. Boundaries are actually a discipline in a practice. And again, Dr. Pooja Lakshmi talks about boundaries a lot, and she's really brilliant on self-care. And if anyone's interested in her book, I would highly recommend it, or the podcast we did. But she talks about like practice boundaries. You know, it if you have a lot of privilege, if you don't have a lot of privilege, it's a lot harder to say no. And so you might have to say not right now, or you might have to find a different way to say it until you are able to say no. But boundaries, you have to, there's almost a process to figure out what those are, and then it's certainly a practice to put them in place and to keep them in place and to protect yourself. And I think boundaries are a really important part of this work. I would tell you that I think my family would say I didn't have enough boundaries in the last 11 years. And that is something that I'm working on too, so that, I don't burn out.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I know that that is an absolute chronic problem, and I don't think, any of our work can be accomplished if we don't either establish healthy boundaries or take care of ourselves or do whatever. When I meet people, I get into conversations. What do you do? What is your technique? Because I think it seems to be unique to the individual, to find what renews you, what keeps you going. It is very, very hard. So, let's see. We've covered a lot of ground. Talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing, the women and leadership and assuming power. You're working on a book and you're working on your Substack. You're obviously doing podcasts and interviews with other people. Are those just sort of offshoots of your main interest right now, which is writing your book?
Yeah, I really am spending so much time. My deadline is June, and writing a book is sort of all consuming. And so I'm doing a ton of interviews with women, as I said before, from all walks of life to tell me their stories, capturing those. Some of those, if you go on my Substack, you can join. And I'm telling some of the stories of people I've met through my Substack and those Zooms in my book. And yeah, I think it will all culminate then. And in the meantime, I'm probably mostly on Instagram and Substack.
Mhm. Okay, good. Well, hopefully, we will send out the links to your Instagram, your
Great.
Substack, and your, particularly, the podcast that you recommended. We'll send that out in a follow-up to this call. So, we will also be distributing the recording for this call and leave it on our YouTube channel. So I know that people who were not able to come will very much enjoy being able to catch up with what our conversation covered. So, do you have any final words of wisdom that you can leave us with?
I'm just really grateful to everyone who showed up tonight, and really grateful for all the hard work you do. See, I have seen so much difference in Arizona. I don't know if you all feel that, but it's definitely changing for the better, and it's because of all the hard work all of you do all the time. So I'm really honored to be here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, there is a ton of appreciation, a lot of inspiration, and I think people have just loved the range of subjects that we've covered in this conversation and also the new directions that you're taking. So we will definitely be following and waiting for your book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Nice to see
Right.
all of you.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Night.